Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm afraid I will have to give my presentation in English. My Greek is basically non-existent. Thank you very much for the invitation, for having me here today. Before later today we go into the details and the challenges in the Greek market, I would like to give you a quick overview of what is happening at EU level today and in the coming years. I'm sure you're all aware of how the market is developing in Europe these days, but I just wanted to give you a quick snapshot because this is also the basis for our policy, our decisions we have taken in the past and the decisions we're going to take in the future. It is fair to say that online gambling is a fast developing market. We see today distribution channels we haven't even thought of a couple of years ago, and we see new forms of gambling developing on a regular basis. While online gambling is still a small share of the overall gambling market in the EU, we're talking about 15% by 2015, it already generates 13 billion euros in turnover, or it will generate in 2015, and it's by far the fastest growing segment of the market, which is already one reason why we at Commission level focus so much these days on online gambling, because there we see the real need together with member states and the industry to develop common rules and ideas. Consumers and citizens, and I would like to make a clear distinction there because not everybody is using online gambling services, though more and more people do, use or are exposed to gambling services. The latest figures we have say that about 7 million European citizens use online gambling in the EU, which is a significant number. At the same time, we have quite a number of gambling websites in the European Union which offer their services outside any form of national control, meaning they are not licensed or authorized anywhere in the EU, not to speak about the cross-border issues we have within the EU, but for us this is a bit a different field. The overwhelming majority of websites any consumer in the EU has access today to is from outside the EU and is not controlled by anybody within the EU, which is something that concerns us a lot. Beside the market developments, there are also some significant legal developments over the last years. We see, or have seen, a lot of member states that are regulating online gambling services that have opened their online gambling markets because they had the feeling that the public interest objectives they have, protecting the consumer, preventing fraud and money laundering, safeguarding the integrity of sports, cannot be achieved anymore by simply banning that activity. They're trying, or they're putting regular systems in place to channel, as what we all call it, the citizens from the illegal to the legal gambling sites. With that development, but also looking at old legislation, there still remain a lot of legal questions. There remains legal uncertainty. We at the Commission can see that looking at the significant number of infringement cases and complaints we have. And unfortunately, that number is still growing. I can say today we're probably talking about 80 registered complaints we have, which concern the far majority of member states. In our communication, we have said that we have issues with 20 today, so 20 out of 27. That is not a very satisfying situation. At the same time, we have a number of cases from the Court of Justice, more than 20. Almost all of them, though, are preliminary rulings. And preliminary rulings, by their very nature, are not always very clear in what they send as a message to the member state, but also to other market participants. And we have a whole set of principles member states have to respect when they regulate their market, but still there's still a margin of interpretation which makes it sometimes difficult for member states and for operators alike to see what is the proper way to regulate the market at national level. The buzzwords here are consistency and non-discrimination. But what this actually means, I mean, non-discrimination is very easy to fulfill, you would think. Consistency is much more difficult. When do we actually have a consistent national regulatory system? This is one issue that we are also discussing internally. What have we done in the past to face these developments? You're all very well aware that the Commission before 2010 did not really engage in any EU policy on gambling. It was only when Commissioner Barnier took office in 2010 that it was decided that besides the infringement cases which were ongoing since 2004, 2005, we should also start an initiative at political level to somehow find solutions to the challenges I've just described. So we launched a green paper, a public consultation in 2011. We got 260 responses to the 51 questions we had asked in that green paper. Very many of these responses were substantive, hundreds of pages to read, a lot of information we got, a lot of input we got. And of course, the feedback is much broader than the 4 bullets I've listed here, but we believe these are the 4 things we should highlight as the outcome of that consultation. The first one is fairly obvious, and gambling is harmful if not regulated. So everybody should aim for regulation for gambling services. The question is, of course, then how to do it properly in terms of the challenges that you have in terms of technology, society, the law. Gambling services and the fulfillment of the public policy objectives member states have put in place is challenged in a cross-border environment. It is fairly difficult for one member state to control services in the internet. It does not only apply to gambling, that applies to all kinds of online services. Because of these challenges, there has been an almost unanimous call, also from all member states, for action at EU level. However, there were quite diverging opinions on how this action should look like. It was very clear from the outset that most actors, in particular the member states, but also the European Parliament, were very reluctant to sector-specific legislation, at least at this point. We might take it up in the future again, but at this point, it doesn't seem to be appropriate to come forward with legislation because it would simply be not supported by the majority of the market actors, in particular not by the co-legislators. So taking all that in account, we came up with a communication a couple of weeks ago, or as we call it internally, an action plan, which we named Towards a Comprehensive European Framework for Online Gambling. Towards, because it should show that it is a first step. We are not claiming that this is the ultimate solution to all the issues we have today in the market, but we feel that's a fairly good starting point to discuss the open issues we have today. It was adopted on the 23rd of October. It is accompanied by a staff working document, which, if you haven't read it yet, I would like to invite you to read it. It's a fairly long document. It's more than 100 pages, but that's basically all the wisdom we have. This is the outcome of the consultation. This is the outcome of the workshops we had with industry. This is the outcome of all the bilateral meetings we had with member states, with operators, with other services involved. And you will find that in this 104 pages. And this will be the basis for our work in the next years. All the actions, or most of the actions, you will find in the communication itself. In the communication, we have identified 5 priority areas. I will go through them with you in a minute. As I said before, no legislative sector-specific proposal at this time, but a mix of initiatives covering a fairly broad range of issues, and we feel it's evidence-based. What we have proposed is based on the output of the consultation and all the work we have done before. Here you see the 5 key action areas listed. I will immediately go into the first one and not bore you with just giving you the table of content here. So the first one, and kind of a starting point, or one of the two starting points of our new policy, is the compliance of national regulatory frameworks with EU law. As I said before, we have an immense amount of complaints and infringement cases compared to other areas in the Commission. More than 80 infringements and complaints. Of course, one of the reasons is that we have very different rules in the EU, ranging from strict monopolies to very open licensing systems, and because of the difficulty to enforce law at national borders, I mean, these systems naturally interact, and that raises a lot of issues, and that is one of the reasons why the Commission receives so many complaints. But one thing we have said from the outset, what we want to ensure at this point is that still all these systems can coexist. As the Court of Justice has said, and that is respected by us, it's the member state's choice how to regulate the market. If the member state feels that a monopoly is the most appropriate way to regulate the gambling market, the member state should put in place a monopoly system. If the member state believes that an open licensing system is the most appropriate way to meet the public interest objectives, then it should put in place such a system. However, and that's very important for us to stress, whatever system is put in place, it needs to comply with the treaty. And this is our ultimate aim of this exercise. At the end, we would like to achieve a situation where we can say that the 27 regulatory systems in member states do comply with the treaty, whatever the system is. We are now finally determined to enforce the relevant treaty provisions. It's fair to say that in the last years we haven't done a lot on that. I mean, there have been a lot of reasons for that. Since 2008, we haven't taken any decision on the open infringement cases. Because of that long time of non-activity now, we have to give member states an opportunity, a chance to explain what has happened in the meantime. We have to give member states a possibility to also react to the new case law. Of course, since 2008, there has been a lot of activity at the Court of Justice. There has been a lot of new rulings, which also have an influence on the old infringement cases. But in terms of numbers, the old infringement case is actually the smaller share of what we have on our tables today. The complaints is by far more work than that. And of course also there, I mean, we need to give member states an opportunity to explain themselves. Why do they have the system? What are the objectives? Why does a member state believe that the restrictions it has in place are proportionate in view of the case law of the court? So with the adoption of the communication, we have sent these famous letters to member states through different channels depending on the kind of procedure. We have very formal rules on that in the Commission, and we have set deadlines for member states to reply. It's normally between 2 months and 10 weeks if cases are a bit more urgent, or if we felt that we had a lot of interaction with the member state before, it might have been a bit shorter. But that gives you an idea that we expect responses in the course of January, basically. And then we have to go into these replies from 20 member states. It's quite a lot of work. We'll do it as quickly as possible and see what is then our final assessment of each individual case. And then we'll have to take a decision on what to do with each individual case. Do we have grounds to believe that there is an infringement of EU law? Then we'll take it forward. If we have the feeling that the case is unfounded in law, or there is not enough evidence to take it forward, then there is no alternative to close the case. But this is a decision that we'll need to take in the first half of next year. The second starting point of our policy is definitely enhancing administrative cooperation. It was very clear from the outcome of the consultation, but also all the discussions we had with member states, that there is not enough cooperation between member states, between regulatory authorities, for a number of reasons. And we felt that if we want to launch a successful EU policy, we need to bring member states closer to each other. We need to find a solution for all these issues that have not been discussed amongst them before, or which have been discussed, but where nobody put some gentle pressure on them to come also to solutions and not just discuss without any feasible or tangible outcome. So we have stressed two things in the communication. I mean, it's very important that there is an authority in a member state. For us, it doesn't really matter what form it has. Of course, it's always desirable that you have an independent regulator which has all the competences to supervise, to regulate the sector. But we also understand that for some member states that is not really an option. They prefer to have it within a ministry, which is fine with us. As long as there is somebody we can talk to, and as long as there is somebody who actually can respond to demands, to questions from other member states, and where it is clear for one regulator, if he wants to ask a question to another one, to another member state, whom should he actually call? To whom should he write his, send his request? And so we're now about to identify all these players in the member states. And then we want to bring them together. We would like to create a structure where these regulators can talk to each other, where they can exchange information, where they can ask the things that help them in their everyday work, which seems to us is something that is lacking today. That although regulators meet on a regular basis to discuss policy issues, cooperation on everyday regulatory work is still not that developed. It exists between member states on the basis of bilateral agreements, but certainly not at EU level. We will see what means we can use for that. In the beginning, it's probably going to be more informal, also because of the cautious approach we are taking, but because it has been asked to take a step-by-step approach, not to rush into this. So let member states get to know each other, let member states to feel comfortable with each other, and then we can develop more and more this cooperation, go into more sensitive issues. We have one instrument, the Internal Market Information System, which is a system that seems to be perfect in the long term, which would allow regulators to communicate with each other in a protected environment, to exchange all kinds of information, also very sensitive information on operators, on players, and will certainly aim for including gambling into the scope of that system, but that's more for the mid to long term. But we are working on it. We have not forgotten about it. One thing we have been asked by the Parliament, but also by a number of member states, is to see in how far at EU level we can do something about what we call responsive enforcement measures. That includes financial transaction blocking or disabling access to websites. For us, this is a bit a difficult issue, first of all, because we don't have really experience on that. We have a number of member states that use methods to disable access to websites, and we don't question that. As soon as the regulatory system itself is compliant with the treaty, of course, member states need to have means to enforce the system, but it has to be compliant. As far as we have to see how far we can go with these measures at European level. For financial transaction blocking, it's even more limited, the experience. So far, it has been used in an EE member state, in Norway. Experience is mixed, and we'll have to see how to deal with these demands in the future. We have to deal with them somehow because they have been brought to us, but we are only at the beginning of the discussion. One thing the Commission is doing right now, and it might help in particular intermediates, ISP service providers, is trying to clarify the procedure for notifying illegal content and how then these providers should take down this illegal content. But this is only a procedural measure. This does not concern the underlying question, what is legal, what is illegal. And one thing that has also been stressed by member states a lot, and where we feel that this is something that should be a priority in the future, is dialogue with third countries. A lot of the issues we're talking about today in the gambling area do not really originate from the EU, but they originate from outside, from other continents, or they're simply global issues, which do not only concern EU regulators, but they concern regulators in the US, in Asia, in Africa equally. For each member state individually, it's very difficult we feel, looking at the responses, to address these issues with foreign regulators. But together, as EU regulators, we might be able to take a stronger stance in that discussion. Of course, we first of all need to discuss amongst us, what do we actually want to tell these third countries? It's very easy to say we need to launch a dialogue with third countries, but of course we need to define the message first, which is also something we have to do now in the near future in our meetings with member states. The third one, or the third key priority area, is the protection of consumers and citizens. This has been raised by almost everybody in the discussion, that this is an area the Commission, or that should be taken up at EU level. We are not saying that there are no consumer protection rules in member states. Almost all member states have rules to protect consumers when they use gambling services or when they're exposed to gambling services. But they're very diverging. They're very different, these rules. And they're certainly not all at the same level. And because we're talking about cross-border markets, and because there are also member states that still lack experience in this area, which would like to have rules, especially on protecting consumers, we have the feeling that it would be good to have some common standards of protection, in particular on the protection of minors. Again, we're not talking about regulation here. We're just talking about putting common standards in place that should serve as a benchmark for every operator, for every regulator, to see if its national rules meet these standards or if there may be things that could be improved. The same would apply to advertising. This has actually been an issue that was raised particularly by regulators, that advertising is something we need to take up altogether. When it comes to protection of minors, we have a number of other initiatives in the communication, which are in the responsibility of other services of the Commission, testing tools, parental control tools to avoid that minors have actually access to gambling services. It was raised a lot that there is not enough information on gambling addiction, gambling disorders, that more research needs to be done. So we're trying to promote that. There are already projects ongoing, but there's certainly room for improvement on that. And last but not least, and this is also something we like to stress in discussions, that we should look at consumer demand more. And we have the feeling very often member states don't do that when they design legislation, that there is actually true consumer demand for gambling services. And that for 95 to 99% of these people, of these consumers, it's an entertainment service. They like to use it, they like to spend reasonable amounts of money on it, and having that in mind, it seems to, for us, very difficult to say we should then simply ban this. Also knowing that for the vast majority of consumers, it's not really a problem. But to have more information on that, what do actually consumers feel about gambling services, and in particular online gambling services, we're now trying to include that as a particular sector into the yearly consumer market monitoring survey the Commission is doing, to find out more about what do consumers feel about online gambling services in the internal market, the online gambling service offer they use, so to draw conclusions from that for our future policy. The fourth priority area is preventing fraud and money laundering. It is, for good reasons, a main public order objective of member states. Besides consumer protection, preventing fraud and money laundering is always invoked as one of the reasons why member states put national legislation in place. And for good reasons, we don't deny that. Besides money laundering, credit card fraud and theft of banking credentials has been raised as one of the most common problems in this area. And because of those responses, we have designed actions around these two things. First of all, money laundering. This is actually the only legislative initiative we have in our action plan today, which does not concern sector-specific legislation, but you might all be aware that the anti-money laundering directive of the EU is under revision. We expect a new proposal by the beginning of next year. And in that proposal, you will most probably see that the scope of the directive will be extended to all kinds of gambling, so that in the future, regulation at member state level on money laundering needs to cover all forms of gambling, not like today, only casinos. On identity theft, we are not that far yet. We have initiatives launched with colleagues in other services of the Commission to see if there is a need for specific measures tackling identity theft. We expect answers over the next month, but we don't really know yet what kind of measures need to be proposed in that respect. One other important issue, not only for the prevention of fraud and money laundering, but certainly also for the reduction of administrative burden and also to ease the work of regulators, is explore the possibilities of standardization. We see today that there are a lot of standards in place already, that there are a lot of common standards in place in member states. But still, very often operators are requested to reproduce all the evidence, to go through testing procedures from scratch again if they apply for a new license. At the same time, if we put EU standards in place, that should also help regulators, those that enforce law, that supervise operators, to make sure that this equipment, that the software, the hardware complies with the rules in place. If we don't have these diverging rules everywhere, but just one standard, it should make life easy for all of us. And last but not least, and that is also something we got out of the consultation, is there seems to be a lack of understanding and knowledge, in particular in the judiciary in member states, on fraud and money laundering, gambling-related issues. It seems to be a very particular field. We also see that in our daily discussions. There's a lot of misunderstanding about what fraud and money laundering actually means in the gambling area and where does it actually occur. And we're trying to convince member states that they put more effort on informing their judiciary, but probably also other people involved in the enforcement of these rules about the specificities of gambling-related fraud and money laundering. And last but not least, the fifth area is very en vogue these days, and it is, of course, also a real issue, is safeguarding sport integrity and preventing match fixing. It's a very particular and challenging type of fraud. It has been occurred, unfortunately, over the last years. And when you read the media, you have the feeling it occurs more and more often, although we still don't really know what is actually the scale of the problem. When a scandal appears and the media is reporting about it, it always seems to be very present, but we are still lacking overall figures on the actual extent of the problem. One of the reasons might be already because although there are a lot of efforts made by member states, by operators, by sports organizations, those are all individual efforts. They are not necessarily linked. They are working in parallel, but not together. They are working on the basis of regulation, but they're also working on the basis of self-regulation. So it's quite a patchwork out there. What we are trying to achieve in the future, within our competence, which is betting-related match fixing, is to have more cooperation, to link all these initiatives, to gather the knowledge, the expertise, and also the data all these systems generate, to have a better knowledge base to see in the future what we can do on that. Here we will propose, not now, but more in 2014, a third recommendation on best practices to prevent and combat betting-related match fixing. 2014, because right now, you probably all know that the Council of Europe had started an initiative on preventing match fixing, and we would like to see first what's the outcome there. We will be involved in that work. We'll be involved in the discussions at the Council of Europe level with different Commission services. And then we will see how we can, on top of that, improve the situation by proposing recommendations on betting-related match fixing. There will certainly still be room for such measures within the EU, but naturally the competences or the cooperation within the EU is more intense than in the Council of Europe. Also there, we would like to promote international cooperation, because we all know that the problem is not necessarily an EU problem, but it very often originates from outside the EU. So we're seeking dialogue as well here with third countries. And at the same time, as we found out through studies, through consultations, that there is a lack of enforcement also in some member states, also because the systems are not really equipped to follow up on all these incidents. We are urging member states to improve the regulatory system on this issue at their level, to establish contact points, and to equip national systems with the means necessary to follow up on these incidents and to ensure that match fixing does not occur in the future. Well, that was a quick summary of the 5 key action areas. You will find more information in the documents. At the end, I would like to stress that, of course, we are not doing this alone. We can't do that alone. We don't have the experience. We don't have the know-how. We don't have the resources to do all that. In our work over the next 1-2 years on these proposals, we very much rely on cooperation, on the one hand with member states, and on the other hand with the gambling sector, with the industry, with the associated services. For that purpose, we have already set up an expert group on gambling, in which all the member states meet, the gambling regulators meet on a regular basis. The first meeting was just last week, where we also presented this action plan, where we started discussion on some of the priorities in there, in particular on administrative cooperation and consumer protection. And there we count on member states to tell us what they would like to see in these initiatives, what would be their priority in designing these initiatives. At the same time, and that's still to come, we'll of course start also a dialogue with stakeholders. We'll have workshops with the industry, basically discussing the same questions with the industry. And then we'll take all the input we have when drafting and proposing these initiatives. And another important point is, and as I said in the beginning, this is a first step. And a first step needs to be evaluated. So this is why at the end of the communication we said, well, we give ourselves 2 years, which is an ambitious target, looking at how much time it will take actually to come up with all these proposals and to adopt them, and see how far we get with the measures we have proposed. If we get the feeling then that the measures are sufficient to deal with all the problems, that would be, of course, fantastic. Then we could just take our time and see how the market develops. Though we have the feeling that these measures are not sufficient, that they are not really achieving the objectives for which they have been designed, then of course we have to rethink our policy, and then we might need to come up with other measures. But that's a thing for the future, as I said, in 2 years. You will find all the documents I've been talking about under this email address. And if you have any questions on what I've said now, on what you will find in the documents, that's our email address where you can ask all the questions you have. Thanks a lot.